Some Main Problems of Philosophy by G.E. Moore, quotes. Some Main Problems of Philosophy by G.E. Moore is a collection of lectures that addresses foundational questions within the field of philosophy, particularly focusing on epistemology, metaphysics, and the nature of reality. In this book, Moore explores the concepts of sense data, the existence of external objects, and the problems surrounding perception and knowledge. He challenges prevailing idealistic views and aims to defend common-sense realism, offering a clear analysis of what we know and how we know it. Moore's discussions are noted for their emphasis on clarity, directness, and the insistence that philosophical questions should be approached with attention to everyday experience. Quote 1. The first and most important problem of philosophy is to give a general description of the whole universe. Here, Moore emphasizes that the primary goal of philosophy is to provide a comprehensive understanding of the universe. He notes that this task involves identifying and categorizing the most significant aspects of the universe and explaining how they relate to one another. Quote 3. There is no other science which tries to say, such and such kinds of things are the only kinds of things that there are in the universe, or which we know to be in it. Moore highlights a distinguishing characteristic of philosophy, that it attempts to account for the entirety of existence, which separates it from the more specialized focus of other sciences. Philosophy's scope is uniquely broad, seeking to determine the types and relationships of all things in the universe. Quote 4. Common sense believes that there are in the universe at least two different kinds of things. There are, to begin with, enormous numbers of material objects, and there are also a very great number of mental acts, or acts of consciousness. Moore acknowledges the view of common sense, which divides the universe into two categories, material objects and acts of consciousness. This belief underscores a fundamental distinction in human understanding between physical entities and mental experiences. Quote 5. We believe that we are at certain times conscious of certain material objects. We see and feel and think of them. But we believe with the utmost certainty that these material objects can and do continue to exist, even when we are not conscious of them. Moore addresses the belief that the existence of material objects is independent of human perception. He reinforces the idea that objects continue to exist whether or not they are being observed, a central tenet of the common-sense view of reality. Quote 6. We believe that the vast majority of material objects are unconscious. This quote asserts the belief that most physical objects in the universe do not possess consciousness. Moore distinguishes between conscious beings, such as humans and animals, and the rest of the inanimate, unconscious material objects, which make up the majority of the universe. Quote 7. We believe that all material objects and all the acts of consciousness of ourselves and other animals upon the earth are in time. Here, Moore discusses the concept of time in relation to material objects and consciousness. He explains that both physical entities and mental acts exist within the framework of time, meaning they have a past, present, and future. Quote 8. We believe that we do really know all these things that I have mentioned. Moore concludes by affirming the confidence common sense has in its understanding of the universe. He suggests that there is a firm belief in the knowledge humans possess about material objects and consciousness, as well as the relationships and facts associated with them. Quote 9. No doubt, philosophers who have said this or something like it have not meant by it quite what they said. Moore suggests that many philosophers may not fully grasp the implications of their own statements when they argue that material objects and acts of consciousness are the only things in the universe. He indicates that this oversimplifies reality because philosophers often overlook abstract entities like space and time, which are neither material objects nor acts of consciousness, yet are undeniably present in the universe. Quote 10. For my part, I think there certainly are several other kinds of things, and that it is one of the objects of philosophy to point them out. Moore expresses his belief that philosophy has a broader role than simply analyzing material objects and acts of consciousness. He argues that philosophy should also identify other essential entities, like space and time, that don't fit into these categories but are crucial for a full understanding of the universe. Quote 11. We might, for instance, say, there really is not, and never has been, anything in the universe, except material objects in space, on the one hand, and acts of consciousness, more or less similar to those of men and animals, attached to living bodies more or less similar to theirs, on the other hand. Moore discusses the plausible view that the universe consists only of material objects and acts of consciousness. This view holds that these are the only substantial things known to exist, a perspective that, while simple, aligns with common sense, yet remains open to philosophical debate. Quote 12. Some philosophers have held, namely, that there certainly is in the universe something else beside material objects and our acts of consciousness, and something substantial too, but that we do not know what the nature of this something is, that it is something unknown or unknowable. Here, Moore describes a philosophical stance that suggests there is a substantial but unknown and unknowable element in the universe. This idea extends beyond common sense by asserting the existence of something more than material objects and acts of consciousness, though its nature remains a mystery. Quote 13. To know, not only that there may be, but that there certainly is in the universe something substantial besides material objects, and our acts of consciousness, is certainly to know a good deal. Moore emphasizes that asserting the existence of a mysterious, substantial element in the universe implies significant knowledge. This contrasts with the more modest view that there may be unknown things, as it claims a definite, though undefined, presence in reality. Quote 14. The first variety of this type is that which asserts that we simply do not know at all whether there are any material objects in the universe at all. Moore introduces a skeptical view, which challenges common sense by suggesting that we cannot be sure of the existence of material objects. This philosophical skepticism questions the certainty of what we perceive and assume to be real in the universe. Quote 15. And it would cease to be illogical if, instead of asserting that no man knows of the existence of any other mind, the philosopher were to confine himself to the assertion that he personally does not. Moore critiques a solipsistic position, where a philosopher claims to know only their own mind's existence. He argues that this stance is inconsistent unless it is restricted to a personal admission of ignorance, rather than a universal claim about others' consciousness. Quote 16. Berkeley's view may, I think, be said to have been that these appearances are in fact not appearances of anything at all. Moore reflects on Berkeley's philosophy, suggesting that Berkeley denied the existence of material objects, instead viewing the world as a collection of appearances that are not representations of external objects. This marks a major departure from common sense, which assumes material objects exist independently of perception. Quote 17. The evidence of the senses is, therefore, the evidence upon which all our other ways of knowing material objects seems to be based. Moore stresses that sense perception forms the foundation of all knowledge regarding the existence of material objects. He suggests that without initial knowledge gained through the senses, it would be impossible to know about any material objects, whether through memory, testimony, or inference. Quote 18. What we mean by a sensation in this phrase is my seeing of the color, not the color which I saw. Moore differentiates between the sensation, which refers to the experience of perceiving, and the sense data, which are the things perceived, such as color. This distinction is important because it clarifies that sensation involves an internal mental act, whereas sense data refers to external characteristics, like color, shape, or size. Quote 19. Each of us, in all probability, saw to begin with a slightly different shade of color. Moore observes that individuals perceive slight variations in sense data, such as color, due to different physical conditions like light and angle. This implies that even though multiple people may claim to see the same object, their perceptions of it may differ subtly based on their unique vantage points and sensory capacities. Quote 20. Now all this seems to me to show very clearly that, if we did all see the same envelope, the envelope which we saw was not identical with the sense data which we saw. Moore concludes that the material object itself is not the same as the sense data perceived by individuals. Since the sense data, such as color, size, or shape, can vary among observers, the object must be distinct from these varying experiences, pointing to the independence of material objects from perception. Quote 21. And here is another. It seems to me conceivable, here again I do not say it is true but conceivable, that some sense data, this whitish color for instance, are in the place in which the material object, the envelope, is. Moore introduces the possibility that sense data, such as color, might actually coincide spatially with the material object. However, he maintains uncertainty about whether this is the case, suggesting that this view is conceivable but not definitive. Quote 22. Certainly, therefore, the sense-given shape which some of you see is not the shape of this side of the envelope. Moore argues that sense-given shapes are not necessarily identical to the real shape of an object, such as the envelope. Different observers may perceive different shapes based on their position, leading to the conclusion that the perceived shapes may not match the actual geometry of the object. Quote 23. There is, then, a difference between two different kinds of identity: qualitative identity and numerical identity. Moore distinguishes between qualitative identity, where two things share similar qualities, and numerical identity, where two things are identical in their entirety. This distinction is crucial in understanding that even if two shapes appear similar in form, they are not necessarily the same object. Quote 24. Of the three kinds of sense data, then, which all of you saw when I held up the envelope, namely, the whitish color, its size, and its shape, the following things seem to be true. Moore sums up that sense data, color, size, and shape, are not guaranteed to match the properties of the real object. Each observer might perceive different sense data, none of which can be conclusively identified as belonging to the material object, illustrating the complexities of sense perception. Quote 25. They have held what are find. One, that absolutely no part of the sense data which I ever apprehend exists at all, except at the moment when I am apprehending it. Moore describes the prevailing philosophical view that sense data only exist while they are being perceived. Once the perception ends, the sense data cease to exist, much like an ephemeral phenomenon that only exists in the moment of experience. Quote 26. It is denied that any two of you are at this moment seeing, even in part, the same sense data. This quote highlights the idea that sense data are private to each individual. Even if two people are looking at the same object from the same angle, they are not experiencing identical sense data. Each person has their own unique set of sense data that is numerically distinct from those of others. Quote 27. No sense datum that is directly apprehended by one person can be in the same place with any sense datum apprehended by any other person. Moore explains the philosophical position that sense data, being private to each individual, have no spatial relationship to those perceived by others. Each person's perception exists in a separate, private space that is independent of anyone else's experience of the same object. Quote 28. I think many philosophers have assumed more or less unconsciously that this way of having things before the mind, which I call direct apprehension, is the only way in which we ever have anything before our minds. Moore critiques the assumption that knowledge is limited to the direct apprehension of sense data. He argues that there are other ways of knowing, which go beyond merely perceiving sense data, challenging the notion that perception is the sole mode of mental engagement with the world. Quote 29. But, then, on the same hypotheses, nobody can even think that there might be anything else. for to think that there might possibly be something other than your own sense data and images certainly does not merely consist in directly apprehending a certain number of sense data, or images, or both. Moore highlights a paradox in the accepted view of sense data. If all knowledge is confined to private sense data and images, it would be impossible to conceive of anything beyond them. However, the very act of thinking about something beyond one's own sense data implies a form of knowledge that transcends direct apprehension. Quote 30. If we do ever know of the existence of material objects by means of our senses, our knowledge of their existence, on the accepted view with regard to sense data, must, I think, partly consist in one of these other ways of knowing. Moore argues that our knowledge of material objects cannot be reduced to the direct apprehension of sense data alone. There must be other cognitive mechanisms involved that allow us to recognize the existence of objects beyond what is immediately perceived. Quote 31. We must know, when we directly apprehend certain sense data, that there exists also something other than these sense data, something which we do not directly apprehend. Moore suggests that perception involves more than just the apprehension of sense data. It includes the implicit recognition that there are external objects, material things, that exist independently of the sense data we perceive, even if we do not directly apprehend these objects. Quote 32. The seeing of sense data consists in directly apprehending them, but the seeing of a material object does not consist in directly apprehending it. Moore clarifies the difference between perceiving sense data and perceiving material objects. While sense data are directly apprehended, material objects are not. They are inferred or known through the sense data, but are not themselves immediately perceived. Quote 33. The fact is that absolutely all the contents of the universe, absolutely everything that is at all, may be divided into two classes, namely into propositions on the one hand, and into things which are not propositions on the other hand. Moore proposes that the entire universe can be categorized into two distinct groups, propositions and non-propositions. This classification highlights the philosophical distinction between what can be expressed and analyzed as a proposition, a statement with a truth value, and everything else, emphasizing that the entire spectrum of existence falls into one of these two categories. Quote 34. When I call a thing a proposition, I shall mean to ascribe to it absolutely no properties, except certain definite ones which some things certainly have. Moore explains that he uses the term proposition in a very specific way, limiting its meaning to objects that possess certain unambiguous properties. This approach sets clear boundaries for what constitutes a proposition, helping to avoid confusion or unnecessary expansion of its definition. Quote 35. The sort of thing which I mean by a proposition is rather the sort of thing which these collections of words express. Here, Moore clarifies that propositions are not the actual words or sentences themselves, but the meanings they convey. This distinction between linguistic expression and meaning underscores the idea that propositions are the underlying content or ideas expressed through language. Quote 36. It is quite plain, I think, that when we understand the meaning of a sentence, something else does happen in our minds besides the mere hearing of the words of which the sentence is composed. Moore highlights the mental process involved in understanding a sentence, distinguishing it from the mere act of hearing. This point emphasizes that comprehension is an active cognitive event, separate from the passive reception of sound, indicating a deeper interaction with the meaning behind the words. Quote 37. In calling them so, I do not mean to assert anything whatever as to the manner in which they are related to the apprehension of them. Moore clarifies that when he refers to propositions, he is not making any claims about how they relate to the act of apprehension. This neutrality helps to focus on the nature of propositions themselves without delving into their metaphysical relationship with human cognition. Quote 38. The difference between the three cases merely consists in the fact that when we believe or disbelieve, we also do something else beside merely apprehending the proposition. Moore points out that belief or disbelief involves additional mental activity beyond merely understanding a proposition. This distinction helps explain the varying mental attitudes we adopt when engaging with propositions, whether we accept, reject, or simply understand them without commitment. Quote 39. The propositions which we apprehend in this sense, and in all these different cases, are obviously quite a different sort of thing from many of the things which we apprehend. Moore asserts that propositions are fundamentally different from other types of apprehended objects, such as sense data. This reinforces the unique nature of propositions, which stand apart from direct sensory experiences, highlighting their role as abstract intellectual objects. Quote 40. We may apprehend the proposition and desire to express it, but none of the words we can think of will express exactly the proposition we are apprehending and desiring to convey. Moore illustrates the sometimes elusive nature of propositions by showing that we can grasp a proposition mentally even when we struggle to find the right words to express it. This demonstrates that propositions exist independently of language and are not limited to linguistic expression. Quote 41. Whenever we do apprehend a proposition, we always also apprehend things which are not propositions, namely, things which would be expressed by some of the words, of which the whole sentence, which would express the proposition, is composed. Moore explains that whenever we grasp a proposition, we are also apprehending non-propositional elements, such as the objects or concepts conveyed by individual words in the sentence. This distinction emphasizes that propositions consist not only of meaning as a whole, but also of the individual components that contribute to that meaning. Quote 42. Propositions, in the sense in which I have been using the term, are obviously a sort of thing which can properly be said to be true or false. Moore asserts that propositions, as he defines them, can be judged for their truth or falsity. This is a fundamental characteristic that distinguishes propositions from other types of entities, allowing them to be evaluated based on their alignment with reality. Quote 43. What we do, I think, mean, when we say that both persons have the same belief, is that what is believed in both of the two different acts is the same. We mean by a belief, in fact, not the act of belief, but what is believed. And what is believed is just nothing else than what I mean by a proposition. Moore clarifies that when two people share the same belief, it is the proposition they believe that is identical, not the act of belief itself. This highlights the distinction between belief as a mental act and the proposition that the belief concerns. Quote 44. Nothing but a proposition can be true or false in exactly the same sense in which propositions are so. Moore emphasizes that truth and falsity in their proper sense apply only to propositions. This underlines the unique role propositions play in logical discourse, where their evaluation as true or false is central to understanding. Quote 45. In order to have an idea of the something else, I must not only apprehend an image, which is in fact like the something else. I must also either know or think that the image is like the something else. Moore argues that simply perceiving something that resembles another object does not amount to having an idea of that object. True knowledge or ideas require a conscious recognition or belief about the relationship between the image and the object. Quote 46. Error always consists in believing some proposition which is false. This quote highlights the essence of error. It arises from believing in propositions that do not correspond to reality. Error is thus intimately connected with false propositions, making propositions the basis for distinguishing between truth and falsehood. Quote 47. Some propositions may be about several different things, but all of them are about at least one thing. Moore points out that propositions always refer to something, whether it be one or multiple entities. This essential feature of propositions links them to the external world, where they assert something about objects, concepts, or states of affairs. Quote 48. I propose to say that I am now indirectly apprehending the patch of color which I saw just now when I looked at this envelope, meaning by that the two things that I am directly apprehending a proposition about it, but am not directly apprehending the thing itself. Moore introduces the concept of indirect apprehension, where one grasps a proposition about an object without directly perceiving the object itself. This distinction illustrates how thought or memory allows us to engage with things that are not currently present to our senses. Quote 49. A proposition is quite a different sort of thing from any image or collection of images. Moore emphasizes that propositions are fundamentally distinct from images or collections of images. While images represent visual or mental copies of things, propositions convey meaning and truth, making them a separate category of thought. Quote 50. But obviously, the mere direct apprehension of this image is not the same thing as believing that there was or is or might be in the universe anything else at all besides the image. Moore explains that simply having an image in the mind does not equate to belief in the existence of something beyond that image. Belief requires the acknowledgement of something external to the mental representation, which is a separate cognitive process. Quote 51. Indirect apprehension may be a bad name for this relation, but it is, I think, a relation which needs a name, for it is a perfectly definite kind of relation which we certainly do constantly have to things. Moore recognizes that while the term indirect apprehension may not be ideal, it describes a necessary and recurring mental relation. This relation occurs when we think about or remember something without directly perceiving it, marking a distinct mode of consciousness. Quote 52. In the case of some of these words, many different words are all used to denote exactly the same relation. And in the case of some also, the same word is used, on different occasions, to denote entirely different relations. Moore points out that language often uses multiple words to express the same type of cognitive relationship, while sometimes the same word is applied to different cognitive experiences. This observation highlights the complexity and ambiguity in how we describe ways of knowing. Quote 53. All cognitive relations of this type, therefore, have an essential reference to direct apprehension or indirect apprehension. None of them can be defined except by reference to one or the other. Moore explains that all types of cognitive relations, even those that occur when we are not directly thinking about or perceiving an object, ultimately depend on either direct or indirect apprehension. These fundamental modes of knowing serve as the basis for all cognitive relations. Quote 54. You certainly do not really know that your hat is hanging in the hall, if in fact your hat is not hanging there. Moore underscores the distinction between belief and knowledge. Believing something does not guarantee knowledge. Knowledge requires that the proposition believed must be true. If a belief is false, it cannot be considered knowledge. Quote 55. There is, therefore, a sense of the word know, in which, if you are to know a proposition to be true, you must indeed directly apprehend it. But this is not enough. Several other conditions must also be fulfilled besides. Moore notes that simply apprehending a proposition is not sufficient for knowledge. For a proposition to be known as true, additional conditions must be met, such as belief in the proposition and its actual truth, distinguishing knowledge from mere apprehension. Quote 56. Whenever I remember anything, I do, in a sense, know the thing that I remember. Whenever I imagine anything, I do, in a sense, know the thing that I imagine. Moore discusses how memory and imagination still involve a form of knowing, even if they are not direct forms of knowledge. These cognitive processes engage with things not currently present, yet they still represent a way of interacting with or thinking about the world. Quote 57. Suppose, for instance, a man believes now that it will not rain on the 20th of June next year, and suppose that when the time comes, it actually does not rain. In that case, what he believes now, when he believes it will not rain on that day, is a proposition which is, in fact, true. And yet we certainly should not admit that he now really knows that it will not rain. Moore explains that even if someone's belief about a future event turns out to be correct, it does not necessarily mean that the person had knowledge of the event beforehand. Knowledge, in this sense, requires more than just a true belief. It requires justification or some additional condition that makes the belief more than just a lucky guess. Quote 58. There is a sense of the word know, which involves, beside direct apprehension, also 3 other conditions. And this is by far the most important of all the senses of the word know. Moore points out that knowledge in its proper sense is more than just direct apprehension of a proposition. It involves additional conditions, such as belief and truth, making this the most significant and rigorous understanding of knowledge. Quote 59. When you say you see a material object, an envelope for instance, you may mean that you see only a part of it. But on the accepted view with regard to sense data, no part of the sense data or images which you ever directly apprehend is a part of a material object. Moore emphasizes the distinction between seeing sense data and perceiving material objects. According to the accepted philosophical view, what we directly apprehend as sense data is not the same as the material object itself, suggesting that perception involves something beyond direct visual experience. Quote 60. If all that ever happened when we saw or perceived or observed material objects were that we directly apprehended certain sense data which were in fact connected with them, we should never, by merely seeing or perceiving or observing them in this sense, get to know that they existed at all. Moore argues that merely apprehending sense data does not provide knowledge of the existence of material objects. For us to truly know that an object exists, we must go beyond just perceiving sense data. We need to apprehend something about the object's existence itself. Quote 61. Even if we do indirectly apprehend something else beside the sense data, that only means that we think of something else beside them. And from the fact that you think of a thing, it by no means follows that there is any such thing as what you think of. Moore explains that merely thinking about something beyond the sense data we perceive does not guarantee the existence of that thing. There is a distinction between imagining or thinking about an object and knowing for certain that the object exists. Quote 62. Even if, when I look at this envelope, I do know that there exists something else beside the sense data which I am directly apprehending, it does not follow that I know that this something else is situated anywhere in space, nor yet that it may not be a mind nor the active consciousness of some mind. Moore underscores that even when we believe in the existence of something beyond the sense data we perceive, it does not necessarily mean we know that this thing is a material object located in space. It could be something entirely different, like a mental state or consciousness. Quote 63. We are now talking of knowledge in the sense in which you cannot know anything but a fact, and in which you do not know a fact, unless besides merely directly apprehending a proposition which would be expressed by the same words, you also believe this proposition, and it is true. Moore defines knowledge as being limited to facts, requiring not only the apprehension of a true proposition, but also belief in that proposition. This highlights the stringent conditions that must be met for a belief to qualify as knowledge. Quote 64. Hume's views are, moreover, of great importance historically. Certain points in them suggested to the German philosopher Kant some of the most remarkable of his own views. Moore acknowledges the profound influence of Hume's philosophy, particularly on Kant. Hume's skeptical approach to knowledge shaped Kant's thinking and, in turn, had a significant impact on the direction of modern philosophy. Quote 65. The mere feeling of certainty, therefore, even though it be very intense, is not the same thing as knowledge. Knowledge in the sense which I have called knowledge proper. Moore highlights the distinction between feeling certain about a belief and actually knowing something. Intense certainty does not necessarily equate to true knowledge. Knowledge proper requires additional criteria beyond just strong belief. Quote 66. Propositions which do not assert existence can, he says, be known in 2 ways. Some can be known by intuition, and others can be known by demonstration. This quote explains Hume's view on how propositions that do not deal with existence can be known. They are either known through intuition, where the truth of a proposition is self-evident, or through demonstration, where logical proof confirms its truth. Quote 67. No propositions which assert the existence of anything, past, present, or future, can be known in either of these two ways. More conveys Hume's belief that propositions asserting the existence of things cannot be known through intuition or demonstration. Such propositions require a different kind of evidence, as they cannot be self-evident or proven like mathematical truths. Quote 68. Suppose I am now directly apprehending, or have directly apprehended, something B with regard to which I know that it, B, would not have existed at all unless something else, A, had existed before it. Then, says Hume, I may really know that A did exist before it. More describes Hume's principle that knowledge of the existence of something, A, can only be established if we know that another thing, B, which we directly apprehend, could not have existed without the existence of A. This is central to Hume's theory of knowledge of existence. Quote 69. I cannot really know that my own brain is existing at this moment, unless I also know one or other of two things. Here, More explains that according to Hume, knowledge of the present existence of something, such as one's brain, requires fulfilling specific conditions. Without these conditions, we cannot claim to truly know the existence of the object. Quote 70. Unless one or other of these alternatives is fulfilled, I cannot, Hume says, possibly really know that my brain is existing at this moment. More reiterates Hume's claim that we can only know something exists if certain conditions are met, such as linking it to something directly apprehended. Without these connections, knowledge of existence is impossible. Quote 71. It seems obvious to say that I could not know this except by experience. This quote captures Hume's view that knowledge of causal relationships, such as knowing an object will fall when dropped, comes solely through experience. Experience is essential to understanding how events are connected. Quote 72. Hume then lays down two rules. 1. That in order absolutely to know that B must have been preceded by A, I must have observed in the past that things like B were constantly preceded by things like A, and 2. That in order to know that B was probably preceded by A, I must have observed in the past that things like B were generally preceded by things like A. More outlines Hume's two rules for knowing causality. Certainty of cause and effect requires constant observation, while probability requires general observation. These rules explain how experience informs our understanding of cause and effect. Quote 73. The fact that another person has had certain experiences is itself a thing which I myself have never directly apprehended. More explains that our knowledge of other people's experiences is indirect. We do not directly perceive their experiences. Instead, we infer their experiences based on external signs, such as language or actions, which we can directly apprehend. Quote 74. If I hear statements made to the effect that I myself shall observe or have observed certain things, and if I constantly observe that, when I do hear such statements, made in a certain way and under certain conditions, then I do really see or have really seen the things which the statements asserted that I had seen or should see. I might, in this way, upon Hume's own principles, arrive at the generalization that statements made in a certain way were as a general rule true. More discusses how repeated experience of statements aligning with observed reality can lead us to trust such statements. According to Hume, this process allows us to generalize that statements about unobserved events made under similar conditions are likely to be true. Quote 75. When we talk of knowledge that is based on observation, we do not generally mean by observation direct apprehension. More highlights that in common usage, the term observation refers to more than just direct sensory experience. Observation often includes inferences about the material world, even though we only directly apprehend sense data, not the objects themselves. Quote 76. What they assert is that any knowledge I may have of the existence or probable existence of anything whatever that I have not directly apprehended must be based on observation, either my own observations or the observations of other people. Moore summarizes Hume's principle that all knowledge of unobserved things must be based on direct or indirect observation. This means that either our own senses or the testimony of others forms the foundation of our understanding of the world beyond immediate perception. Quote 77. I can never know that B was even probably preceded by A unless either I have myself observed that things like B were generally preceded by things like A, or unless I have myself observed that statements like some statement, which asserts that someone else has observed a general connection between things like B and A, are generally true. Moore explains that, according to Hume, we can only know causal relationships if we have directly observed them or have reliable second-hand accounts from others who have observed similar patterns. This sets strict conditions on how we acquire knowledge about cause and effect. Quote 78. I do, in fact, believe that there are at the present moment bones in this hand of mine. But I am certainly not directly apprehending at this moment any of these bones. Moore provides an example of belief in something that cannot be directly apprehended, such as the bones in one's hand, highlighting the limits of direct observation. This example illustrates the type of knowledge Hume's principles aim to address, where we infer the existence of unseen things. Quote 79. But many philosophers have supposed that there are insuperable objections to supposing that any such color, the color of the skeleton, does really exist at this moment in connection with the sense data which I see. Moore acknowledges a philosophical argument that challenges the idea that objects, such as a skeleton, possess intrinsic properties like color when not directly perceived. This raises doubts about whether material objects have characteristics independent of our perception of them. Quote 80. If, therefore, it were self-evident, as Berkeley says, that nothing resembling a sense datum can ever exist except in someone's mind, it would follow that no material object exists at all. Moore reflects on Berkeley's view that sense data only exist in the mind, which leads to the conclusion that material objects do not exist independently. If Berkeley's claim were true, it would undermine the existence of the external, material world. Quote 81. The existence of one thing, A, is a sure sign of the existence of another thing, B, whenever you can truly say, since A exists, it is certain that B did exist before it, does exist at the same time, or will exist after it. Moore explains Hume's idea that one thing can be a definitive indicator of another. If you can state with certainty that the existence of A means that B existed, exists, or will exist, then A serves as a sure sign of B. This is the foundational concept of understanding connections between events or objects. Quote 82. Nobody ever knows that anything B, which he himself has not directly apprehended, certainly did exist, or does exist, or will exist, unless he knows that the existence of some thing or set of things, A, which he has directly apprehended, is a sure sign of the existence of B. According to Hume, no one can know with certainty that something exists unless they have directly observed something else that definitively indicates its existence. This restricts our knowledge of unobserved things to cases where we have a clear and reliable connection to observed events or objects. Quote 83. No man, he says, ever knows that the existence of any one thing A is either a sure sign or even a probable sign of the existence of another thing B, unless somebody has in the past experienced a general conjunction between things like A and things like B. Moore highlights Hume's view that knowledge of connections between things comes from observing a consistent relationship between similar things in the past. Without this repeated experience, we cannot know that one thing indicates the existence of another. Quote 84. Nobody can be said to have experienced a conjunction between any two things unless he has directly apprehended both the things. For Hume, experience of a relationship between two things requires direct observation of both. This underscores the importance of direct experience in establishing knowledge of connections between objects or events. Quote 85. They have, I think, argued first, with some plausibility, that if these rules are true, then none of us ever knows of the existence of any material object. Moore addresses the philosophical argument that if Hume's rules are correct, we cannot claim to know the existence of material objects. This challenges our common assumptions about the reality of the physical world, creating a need to either refute or accept these rules. Quote 86. The only question is as to what things beside his own acts of consciousness and the sense data and images which he directly apprehends a man can ever know to exist. Moore presents the fundamental question raised by Hume's theory. Aside from direct experiences, such as sense data and consciousness, what else can a person truly know to exist? This question limits the scope of knowledge to what can be directly apprehended. Quote 87. Nobody can know that there even probably has existed, does exist, or will exist in the universe anything else whatever, except certain things which are in his own mind or else in somebody else's mind. This quote reflects the extreme view that, according to Hume's principles, we can never know anything exists beyond our own mind or the minds of others. It suggests that knowledge of the external world may be impossible except for mental phenomena. Quote 88. We believe quite definitely that the sense data which we now see are signs of the present or immediately past existence of something which certainly has a cylindrical shape, roughly cylindrical, and which certainly has an inside. Moore contrasts the common-sense belief in material objects with philosophical skepticism. He asserts that in everyday life, we naturally believe that the sense data we perceive, such as the appearance of a pencil, correspond to the existence of a real, shaped object with physical properties like a cylindrical structure. Quote 89. I do believe that there are, all along this pencil, circular surfaces, and that there are, within the circle which bounds each of these surfaces, things having shapes similar to those which I should see with the naked eye, if I cut the pencil and looked at the ends. Moore expresses his belief that the pencil possesses an internal structure, even though it cannot be directly observed. He asserts that the object has consistent properties, such as circular surfaces and internal shapes, which would be revealed under certain conditions, like cutting the pencil. Quote 90. Even if sense data of all these kinds really are now in the same place where the pencil is, and I think there are good reasons for doubting whether they are, I certainly believe that there is in that place something else besides. Moore acknowledges that while sense data may give some information about an object, they do not encompass the entirety of what exists. He believes there is more to the pencil than just the observable sense data, suggesting the presence of something beyond immediate perception. Quote 91. If Hume's principles are true, nobody can ever know of the existence of any material object. Nobody can ever know that any such object even probably exists. Moore summarizes the implication of Hume's principles. If they are accurate, we cannot know with certainty, or even probability, that material objects exist. This would challenge our ability to have knowledge of the physical world. Quote 92. I do know that this pencil exists, but I could not know this if Hume's principles were true. Therefore, Hume's principles, one or both of them, are false. Moore presents an argument against Hume's principles, using his own knowledge of the pencil's existence as proof. If he can know the pencil exists, then Hume's principles, which would deny such knowledge, must be incorrect. Quote 93. Neither conclusion follows from its premise, unless this proposition is true, and each does follow from its premise, if this proposition is true. Moore explains that both his argument and his opponent's depend on a shared assumption. If Hume's principles are correct, certain conclusions follow. This highlights the importance of examining the premises underlying both positions. Quote 94. It is certain, then, that if any proposition whatever is ever known by us mediately, or because some other proposition is known from which it follows, some one proposition at least must also be known by us immediately. Moore argues that if we derive knowledge through inference, there must be at least one proposition we know directly, without needing to infer it from anything else. This concept of immediate knowledge is essential to the foundation of understanding. Quote 95. The mere direct apprehension of certain sense data is quite a different thing from the knowledge of any proposition, and yet I am not sure that it is not by itself quite sufficient to enable me to know that the pencil exists. Moore suggests that direct perception of sense data, while different from knowing a proposition, may be sufficient to establish the existence of the pencil. He questions whether the experience of sense data might provide immediate knowledge of material objects. Quote 96. I think, therefore, that the strongest argument to prove that Hume's principles are false is the argument from a particular case, like this in which we do know of the existence of some material object. Moore asserts that the best way to refute Hume's principles is to focus on specific instances where we clearly know a material object exists. These real-world examples, like the existence of a pencil, offer powerful evidence against Hume's skepticism. Quote 97. Do we, any of us, ever know of the existence of any material object? A great many philosophers have come to the conclusion that we do not. Moore raises a fundamental question about whether humans have knowledge of material objects, a topic of significant debate among philosophers. Some thinkers argue that we cannot truly know the existence of material objects, challenging the common assumption that we do. Quote 98. I propose to define a material object by means of three properties, one positive and the other two negative. Moore introduces his definition of a material object by using three key properties, one that affirms the object's spatial existence and two others that distinguish it from sense data and acts of consciousness. This framework sets clear parameters for discussing what constitutes a material object. Quote 99. I propose to say that nothing is a material object except what is situated somewhere or other in space. Moore's first criterion for defining a material object is that it must occupy a position in space. This property establishes the tangible spatial nature of material objects, differentiating them from purely abstract entities or mental phenomena. Quote 100. No sense datum or part of a sense datum or collection of sense data is a material object or a part of one. Moore emphasizes that sense data, such as colors, sounds, and tactile sensations, cannot be equated with material objects. He argues that while sense data are directly apprehended, they are distinct from the material objects they represent or suggest. Quote 101. No mind and no act of consciousness can be a material object. Moore further clarifies that neither minds nor acts of consciousness qualify as material objects. This distinction separates the physical from the mental, reinforcing the idea that material objects exist independently of our thoughts and perceptions. Quote 102. None of them are ever directly apprehended by us, since nothing that exists is ever directly apprehended by us except sense data, and our own minds and acts of consciousness. Moore acknowledges that we never directly perceive material objects themselves, but only the sense data associated with them. This limitation shapes the way we know and understand material objects, relying on indirect evidence rather than direct experience. Quote 103. When people commonly believe in the existence of material objects, they are not believing in the existence of objects which have these three properties, but in something quite different. Moore suggests that common beliefs about material objects might not align with his strict philosophical definition. People may hold different, less precise views about what constitutes a material object in everyday life, compared to the more rigorous criteria used in philosophy. Quote 104. Do you not, in fact, believe that there really are wheels on which your carriage is running at the moment, and couplings between the carriages? That these things really exist at the moment, even though nobody is seeing either them themselves, nor any appearances of them. Moore presents an example of traveling in a train to illustrate how common sense leads us to believe in the existence of unseen material objects, such as wheels and couplings. Even when we are not directly observing these parts, we still assume their existence, which contrasts with certain philosophical views. Quote 105. All that you can possibly know about them is simply that they are something or other, and that they would, under certain circumstances, cause you to have certain sensations. Moore discusses a theory which argues that all we can know about objects, like wheels or couplings, is that they are the cause of potential sensations under certain conditions. This view limits our knowledge to what sensations the object might trigger, without giving us access to the true nature of the object itself. Quote 106. Surely what you believe, when you sit in the carriage, is that it is on the wheels, above them, spatially related to them, that they themselves are something round, and that your carriage is coupled to another which is in front of it, spatially related to it, and that there is a distance between the two. Moore emphasizes that in ordinary life, we naturally believe that objects like wheels have physical characteristics and spatial relations, such as being round or supporting a carriage. This contrasts with more abstract philosophical views that deny such direct knowledge of these objects. Quote 107. The conviction that these things are so seems to me so overwhelming, and the more so the more attentively you consider the matter, that I still do not feel sure that they really are not the case. Moore expresses how difficult it is to dismiss the belief that the sense data we perceive, like the appearance of a hand, continue to exist even when we are not directly observing them. He highlights the strength of our natural conviction that objects maintain their properties beyond immediate perception. Quote 108. Do you, in fact, believe that these alone, or any number of them, are what are actually supporting the carriage, or connecting one carriage with the other? Moore questions whether we truly believe that sense data, such as the colors and tactile sensations we might perceive, are responsible for supporting physical objects, like a carriage, or connecting it to another. This challenges the idea that sense data alone can account for the material properties of objects. Quote 109. The solidity which we do believe to belong to some material objects is not identical with any sense datum, or sort of sense data, which we ever directly apprehend. Moore argues that the solidity we attribute to material objects is not something we can directly perceive through sense data. Instead, solidity is a property of objects that cannot be reduced to the sensations we experience when interacting with them. Quote 110. In defending the view that we do know of the existence of objects having these three properties, I am defending the view which we all do in fact commonly hold, the view of common sense. Moore affirms that his position, which holds that material objects exist in space, are not sense data, and are not minds, aligns with the common sense view of reality. He contrasts this with more skeptical philosophical positions, arguing that everyday beliefs about material objects are grounded in reasonable assumptions. Quote 111. If we are to know that experience itself is a sound basis for any inference whatever, we must first know a principle, which seems to have just as little certainty, if as much, as the proposition that material objects exist. Moore critiques the idea that experience is the sole basis for making inferences about the world. He argues that the assumption that past experiences can reliably predict future events is no more certain than the belief in the existence of material objects, suggesting that both propositions require similar justification. Quote 112. It is not, after all, so very obvious that we do not know of the existence of material objects, and, if so, then no general principle as to the limits of knowledge, from which it would follow that we cannot know of their existence, can be any more obviously true. Moore concludes that it is not self-evident that we lack knowledge of material objects. Therefore, any philosophical principle that claims we cannot know of their existence cannot be considered more certain than the belief that we do know of material objects. Quote 113. Many philosophers seem to hold that it is quite certain that no sense datum, nothing that is like a sense datum, in the sense in which any one color is like any other color, can exist, except when it is directly apprehended by somebody. Moore explains the argument from some philosophers who claim that sense data, such as colors or shapes, only exist when they are being directly perceived by someone. This idea suggests that sense data are dependent on observation for their existence. Quote 114. No material object can exist except when its shape is being directly apprehended by someone. Moore discusses the implication of the view that material objects can only exist when their shapes are being directly perceived. This perspective leads to the conclusion that material objects depend on someone observing them, challenging the idea of their independent existence. Quote 115. We never directly apprehend the identical lines which actually bound any material object. Moore argues that when we perceive the shape of a material object, such as a penny, the lines we see are not identical to the actual lines that bound the object. The shapes we perceive are approximations, and not the precise boundaries of the material object itself. Quote 116. No part of the spaces which any of us ever directly apprehend is identical with any part of the space in which material objects are. Moore concludes that the spaces we directly perceive are not the same as the spaces in which material objects exist. This further suggests that our perceptions of space are not exact reflections of the physical reality of material objects. Quote 117. Common sense certainly does not hold as a certain fact that every part of space in which any material object is at every moment being directly apprehended by someone. Moore highlights that common sense does not support the idea that material objects are only real when they are being observed. Common sense assumes that material objects continue to exist even when they are not being directly perceived. Quote 118. Is it not far more certain that this room is supported by walls having a certain length and breadth and thickness than that length and breadth and thickness cannot exist unless someone is directly apprehending them? Moore argues that it is more plausible to believe in the existence of physical properties, such as walls and their dimensions, than to accept the notion that these properties only exist when observed. He challenges the idea that space and dimensions depend on perception. Quote 119. We can know how things will appear to us, though we can never know what they are like in themselves. Moore presents a Kantian view, suggesting that while we can know how things appear to us based on our mental faculties, we cannot access knowledge of things as they truly are in themselves. This distinction emphasizes the limitations of human perception in understanding the external world. Quote 120. It is not, in fact, a bit plainer how you can know universal synthetic propositions about the action of the human mind than how you could know them about other things. Moore questions Kant's reasoning that we can know universal truths about the mind's functioning, but not about the external world. He suggests that it is no clearer how we can have knowledge of the mind than how we can have knowledge of the physical world, thus challenging Kant's distinction. Quote 121. It is argued in the first place that our own minds do manifestly act upon our bodies, and our bodies on our minds. Moore explains a common view that our minds and bodies interact with each other. This interaction is evident in everyday experiences where mental states affect the body, and physical conditions affect the mind, such as when consuming alcohol alters mental processes, or when mental decisions lead to physical actions. Quote 122. It is not possible that a mind should either act upon or be acted upon by anything whatever, except what is itself a mind or of the nature of a mind. This quote presents the second step in the argument, which asserts that only minds can interact with other minds. It suggests that for anything to affect a mind, it must itself be mental, leading to the conclusion that material objects, including bodies, must be mental in nature if they interact with the mind. Quote 123. It seems nearly as certain as anything can be that our bodies do constantly act upon our minds. Moore affirms the common-sense belief that physical states, such as changes in our bodies, have a direct influence on our mental states. This observation is consistent with our everyday experiences and is widely accepted. Quote 124. If we are to reject this argument at all, we must, I think, find objections to the second step in it, not to this first step. Moore suggests that if we are to challenge the argument that bodies are mental, the focus must be on disputing the claim that only minds can interact with minds, rather than the more accepted idea that bodies and minds do interact. Quote 125. The brain and nerves and all their parts are, on this view, material objects in precisely the sense I have been explaining. Moore explains the modern theory that the brain and nerves are material objects, and that every mental state is accompanied by a specific configuration of brain states. This view maintains that these material structures exist even when not being directly perceived. Quote 126. The first is this. It is urged that a state of the brain, considered merely as a spatial arrangement of material particles, is something so utterly different in kind from a mental act that we cannot conceive how the one should cause or be caused by the other. Moore presents an argument used to deny the interaction between mind and matter, which claims that brain states and mental acts are so different that it is inconceivable how one could cause the other. This argument draws attention to the apparent disconnect between the physical and the mental. Quote 127. I no more understand, in the last resort, how or why the one mental act, the seeing of certain letters, should cause the imagination of certain incidents, than how or why a state of my brain should cause the seeing of the letters. Moore reflects on the difficulty of understanding mental causation, whether it involves one mental act causing another or a brain state causing a mental act. He argues that both types of causation are equally mysterious and challenging to grasp. Quote 128. I conclude, then, that this particular argument to prove that material objects cannot exist, namely, the argument which starts from the common-sense fact that our minds and bodies do interact, and hence concludes that our bodies cannot be material objects, but must themselves be minds or composed of minds, is inconclusive also. Moore concludes that the argument claiming bodies must be mental because they interact with minds is ultimately flawed. He finds no conclusive reason to believe that bodies are minds, or that material objects cannot exist based on the interaction between mind and body. Quote 129. It can also be rigorously and conclusively proved that the world can have had no beginning in time, but must have existed for an absolutely infinite length of time. Moore continues to explain the paradox in Kant's argument by presenting the opposite conclusion, that the world has no beginning and has always existed. Kant asserts that both conclusions are rigorously proven, which creates a logical conflict. Quote 130. Accordingly, in proving that both these two contradictory propositions are true, he has also proved, equally rigorously, that both of them are false. Moore outlines Kant's reasoning, where proving both propositions leads to the paradoxical conclusion that if both are true, they must also be false. This challenges the law of excluded middle, which states that one of two contradictory propositions must be true. Quote 131. If the world exists in time at all, then it must have had a beginning, and if the world exists in time at all, then it can have had no beginning. Moore reframes Kant's conclusions into hypothetical statements, showing that if the world exists in time, it leads to either having a beginning or no beginning. Both hypotheses cannot be true simultaneously, which leads to further complications. Quote 132. If Kant has succeeded in proving the two hypotheticals I mentioned, then he will have proved that the world does not exist in time at all. Moore suggests that if both hypothetical propositions are proven, then the only conclusion is that the world does not exist in time. This interpretation resolves the contradiction by denying the assumption that the world is temporal. Quote 133. It proves absolutely conclusively, if they prove anything, that nothing whatever really exists at any time at all. Moore claims that Kant's arguments, if valid, would lead to the radical conclusion that nothing exists in time. This conclusion goes beyond just proving the world's temporal nature and extends to denying the existence of anything in time altogether. Quote 134. What his arguments require you to admit is not merely this, but that absolutely nothing ever exists in time at all. Moore emphasizes the ultimate conclusion of Kant's argument, which is that nothing, including appearances or phenomena, can exist in time. This interpretation goes beyond Kant's original presentation and asserts a much more extreme outcome. Quote 135. If anything did have it, both of two contradictory propositions would be true. Moore summarizes the core of Kant's argument style, where proving a property leads to a contradiction, and thus the property cannot exist. This logical structure is used to argue against the existence of time, space, and other properties in Kant's philosophy. Quote 136. It can be rigorously and conclusively proved that the world must have had a beginning in time. Moore explains that Kant presents an argument claiming the world must have had a definite starting point in time. This conclusion leads to the notion that time has a finite past, with a specific moment marking the beginning of existence. Quote 137. For if we say that what Kant has proved is merely these two hypotheticals, then he has not proved that two contradictory propositions are both of them true. Moore reframes Kant's arguments into hypothetical propositions, suggesting that if the world exists in time, it either had a beginning or it did not. This approach avoids directly asserting two contradictory claims, but still leads to a troubling conclusion about the nature of time. Quote 138. The whole argument proves, if it proves anything, that if the world exists at any moment at all, then the second alternative must be true, namely, some moment must have been the first when it existed. Moore explains that Kant's reasoning ultimately leads to the conclusion that if the world exists in time, there must have been a first moment when it began. This suggests that the alternative of infinite time without a beginning is impossible, reinforcing the need for a starting point. Quote 139. It does seem to me almost impossible to believe this, and yet I do not know how it can be proved. Moore admits the difficulty in accepting the idea that there was a first moment when the world began, while also acknowledging that it is equally hard to prove the opposite. This reflects the deep complexity and uncertainty surrounding the nature of time and existence. Quote 140. It does seem quite certain that, however far back you go, there must always have been a time before any at which you choose to stop. That in short, the length of past time must have been absolutely infinite. Moore expresses his belief that time must be infinite, with no possible first moment. He finds it hard to imagine a finite past, arguing that time likely extends infinitely into the past, challenging Kant's idea of a beginning. Quote 141. It seems to me that both in the case of time and in that of space, if we mean by space, Euclidean space, there is a valid argument that nothing can possibly exist in space or time. Moore suggests that Kant's argument can be extended to both time and space, concluding that if an infinite series is impossible, then nothing can exist in either time or space. This radical conclusion stems from the inability to reconcile the concept of infinity with existence. Quote 142. Now, Kant himself seems to think that the cases of time and space are different. Moore points out that Kant sees a distinction between the nature of time and space. Kant's arguments about the impossibility of infinite time may not apply equally to space, highlighting the complexities in understanding both concepts and their relationship to existence. Quote 143. We constantly talk about them, and we assume that we positively know immense numbers of propositions about them. Moore reflects on how we commonly discuss measurements like inches, feet, and miles, assuming that we know factual propositions about them. He acknowledges that we often take for granted the knowledge we claim to have about the distances and measurements in our everyday life. Quote 144. There are two chief reasons for supposing that it is doubtful. Namely, 1. That part of the foot rule which you see, and which is an inch in length, would be seen by you equally, and would still be of exactly the same length, whether you saw it with the naked eye, or whether you saw it with magnifying spectacles. Moore points out the first reason for doubting whether we directly apprehend actual inches or lengths. He notes that the same inch on a ruler appears the same regardless of whether we view it with the naked eye or through magnification. This raises questions about whether we truly perceive these measurements directly. Quote 145. There is some reason to suppose that the inch of space, which is occupied by the foot rule, is not occupied by any color. Moore introduces a second reason for doubt. The space taken up by a physical inch on a ruler may not contain any color, unlike the space we directly perceive when looking at the ruler. This further complicates the idea that we can directly apprehend these measurements in the way we think. Quote 146. It is doubtful whether the inches and feet and yards and miles, about which, in ordinary life, we talk with such confidence, are ever directly apprehended by any one of us. Moore asserts that it is questionable whether we ever directly perceive the units of measurement we often discuss in daily life. While we confidently speak about distances and lengths, there is uncertainty about whether we truly apprehend them as they are. Quote 147. It is only with regard to the inches and feet and yards and miles of which we talk in ordinary life that there is any good reason to suppose either of these two things. Moore emphasizes that discussions about infinite extent or infinite divisibility apply only to the conventional measurements we use in everyday life. He makes it clear that these concepts are more relevant to abstract units like inches and miles, rather than to spaces we directly experience. Quote 148. Most philosophers who have used these arguments have not, I think, definitely meant them to apply to any piece of space which we directly apprehend. Moore suggests that philosophers, when discussing space and infinity, are generally not referring to the spaces we directly perceive. Instead, their arguments often focus on abstract spaces like inches, feet, and miles, which are used in everyday measurement but are not directly apprehended. Quote 149. It is doubtful whether we ever directly apprehend any time at all, either the time of ordinary life or any other. Moore shifts the focus to time, raising doubts about whether we ever directly apprehend time itself. Unlike space, where we can identify and perceive certain elements, time is more elusive, and it remains unclear whether we directly experience it in the way we experience space. Quote 150. What I am going to talk about, then, is the space of ordinary life and the time of ordinary life. Moore clarifies that his discussion will focus on the everyday understanding of space and time, the inches, feet, miles, seconds, and hours we talk about in daily life. He sets the stage for an exploration of the common notions of space and time, distinct from philosophical abstractions. Quote 151. If you understand what is meant by any length of time at all, an hour or a minute or a year, it is quite easy to conceive and to understand the proposition that both before and after any minute there was or will be another minute. Moore explains that the concept of infinity, particularly in relation to time, is easy to grasp. If you can comprehend a unit of time, such as a minute, you can also understand that there must always be another minute before or after it, illustrating the notion of infinite time. Quote 152. In the course of the last century, mathematicians have suggested that there might be lines really deserving to be called straight lines, which nevertheless have the apparently impossible property that You would, after passing over a finite number of yards, come back to the very same yard from which you started. Moore introduces the idea of non-Euclidean geometry, where straight lines can curve in such a way that, after traveling a certain distance, one can return to the starting point. This challenges traditional views of space and raises questions about the nature of infinity in spatial terms. Quote 153. It is, therefore, only if the inches and feet and miles of ordinary life are Euclidean that it can be self-evident that there must, starting from any one of them, be an infinite number of others in both directions. Moore emphasizes that the assumption of infinite straight lines, extending endlessly in both directions, only holds if we assume Euclidean space. He points out that the space we talk about in everyday life may not follow these strict geometric rules. Quote 154. I think, then, it is really self-evident that, before the present hour, there must have existed an infinite number of others, and that after the present hour, there will exist an infinite number of others. Moore asserts that the infinite nature of time, both before and after the present moment, is self-evident. This continuous progression of time, without a beginning or end, aligns with common-sense notions of temporal infinity. Quote 155. If an infinite number of years have elapsed before now, there must also have elapsed an infinite number of periods of 1,000,000 years each. Moore highlights the paradoxical nature of infinity by showing that, if time is infinite, there must be infinite sets within that time, such as periods of 1,000,000 years. This paradox challenges our conventional understanding of how large intervals fit into the broader concept of infinity. Quote 156. These results, and the many similar ones which also follow, are, I think, certainly very paradoxical. Moore acknowledges the counterintuitive conclusions that arise from considering infinity, such as the idea that an infinite series can have the same number of terms as a part of itself. This paradox creates difficulties in fully grasping the implications of infinite sets. Quote 157. The chief reason for distinguishing carefully between this question of the infinite divisibility of space and time and that of their infinite extent is, there seems to be a very great difference between the reasons we have for supposing them to be infinitely divisible and those which we have for supposing them to be infinite in extent. Moore distinguishes between infinite divisibility and infinite extent, noting that these two concepts require different reasoning. While we may have clear reasons to believe in the infinite extent of space and time, the question of their infinite divisibility raises separate challenges. Quote 158. For my part, I do not know exactly what conclusion ought to be drawn from all these arguments. They are, I think, an excellent example of the way in which philosophical arguments can make things seem uncertain, which, at first, seemed very certain. Moore admits that the philosophical exploration of infinity complicates seemingly straightforward concepts. Through such inquiry, ideas that initially appeared clear, like the nature of space, time, and measurement, become open to doubt and deeper reflection. Quote 159. It holds, I said, that there is not really any such thing as time at all, that nothing whatever really exists or happens in time. Moore introduces the first of two philosophical views on time, which asserts that time does not exist, and therefore nothing happens within it. According to this view, all beliefs about events occurring in time, whether before, after, or simultaneously, are mistaken, as time is considered a false construct. Quote 160. The second might be said to do so also, because, I think, we do find it very difficult to conceive how anything could be truly said to exist or be real at all, if it neither exists now, nor ever existed in the past, nor will exist in the future. Moore discusses a second view, which admits that time exists but sees it as a mere appearance of something beyond time. This view poses a challenge to common sense because it suggests that reality can exist timelessly without being part of the past, present, or future, which is difficult to comprehend. Quote 161. The question whether this first view is true or not does seem to me immensely more important than the mere question whether, besides the things which do exist in time, there are not also others which don't. Moore emphasizes that the first view, whether time exists at all, is far more significant than whether some things exist outside of time. If time is proven unreal, it radically changes how we understand the universe and our existence within it. Quote 162. If indeed it were true that nothing does exist in time, nothing whatever could have any practical importance at all. Moore explains the practical consequences of the idea that time is unreal. If time does not exist, then nothing could have any future consequences or results, rendering all questions of practical importance meaningless, as there would be no future in which anything could matter. Quote 163. I confess I feel that no philosophic opinion, which is actually held by anybody, whatever, however absurd it may appear, and however certainly false, is wholly beneath notice. Moore asserts that even seemingly absurd philosophical views deserve attention. The fact that a philosopher sincerely holds an opinion means that there is some complexity or difficulty worth exploring, even if the view appears irrational or false. Quote 164. Time, like space, has most evidently proved not to be real, but to be a contradictory appearance. Moore quotes Bradley's argument that time, much like space, is not real, but only an appearance that is internally contradictory. Bradley believes that time cannot be real because its inherent contradictions make it impossible to exist. Quote 165. What appears, for that sole reason, most indubitably is, and there is no possibility of conjuring its being away from it. Moore highlights Bradley's insistence that appearances do exist, even if they are not real in the ultimate sense. Appearances, including time, cannot be dismissed simply because they are appearances. They still are in some way and belong to reality. Quote 166. It seems to me quite certain that if, as he thinks he has proved, time were really contradictory, it cannot possibly be true that time exists. Moore questions Bradley's conclusion that time, despite being contradictory, can still be said to exist. Moore argues that if time is truly contradictory, it logically cannot exist, challenging Bradley's distinction between existence and reality. Quote 167. I do want to discuss the question, what is this notion or property, which we mean by the word real? Moore clarifies that his goal is to investigate the concept or property that is conveyed by the word real. He is not merely defining the word for those who don't understand English, but rather examining the underlying idea of reality that the word expresses, aiming to understand its deeper implications. Quote 168. Obviously, even when we do know English, one question which we may raise about the meaning of the word real is this. Is the notion called up in the minds of people who do know English by the word real always the same, or are there several different ones which may be called up by it in different contexts? Moore raises the question of whether the word real always refers to the same concept in every situation, or if it invokes different notions depending on the context. This suggests that the term real might have multiple meanings or interpretations that vary across different uses. Quote 169. If you ask yourself, is the notion conveyed to my mind by the word real in that sentence the same as that conveyed to it by the word real in this sentence? It is not always easy to be sure whether it is the same or not. Moore points out that it can be difficult to determine whether the concept of real in one context is the same as in another. He acknowledges that this ambiguity can lead to confusion and misinterpretation, making it a complex philosophical issue to resolve. Quote 170. We may, for instance, insist that a given thing exists but is not real, or has being but does not exist, because we think that the property which we express by the word exists is different from that which we express by the word real. Moore highlights a common philosophical problem where people distinguish between existence and reality as if they were different properties. This leads to contradictions, such as saying something exists but is not real, or that something has being but does not exist. Quote 171. This property, therefore, which is called up before our minds by this sentence, is at least one of the properties expressed by the word real. And I think myself that this property is at least one of the most important properties expressed by the word real. Moore suggests that when we describe something as real, we are referring to an important property, one that is critical for understanding the nature of the object or concept being discussed. This property is central to our use of the term real in philosophical inquiry. Quote 172. It seems quite plain that, even if we do admit this, it does not follow that griffins are real in the same sense in which elephants are real. Moore illustrates the distinction between imagining something, like a griffin, and asserting its reality. While we can imagine a griffin, it does not mean that it is real in the same way an elephant is real, emphasizing the difference between mental constructs and actual entities. Quote 173. But if so, it follows that we have here two different properties before our minds, one of which may be expressed by the word real when we talk of elephants, and another when we talk of griffins. Moore concludes that the word real can express different properties depending on the context. When we say elephants are real, we are using real in one sense, and when discussing griffins, we invoke a different sense of the word, reflecting the complexity of the term's meaning. Quote 174. He would, I think, be inclined to say, the difference is that griffins are or exist only in the mind or in dependence on it, whereas elephants are or exist not only in the mind, but independently of it. Moore explains a common understanding of the difference between real and imaginary things. Imaginary objects, like griffins, exist only in the mind, while real objects, like elephants, exist independently of the mind. This distinction helps clarify why we consider one set of things to be real and another to be imaginary. Quote 175. This theory would avoid the paradox of saying that all our mental acts are imaginary, since it may, of course, be held that our mental acts do not have being only when they are perceived. Moore points out that by refining our understanding of what it means for something to exist in the mind, we can avoid the issue of labeling mental acts themselves as imaginary. Mental acts, like thoughts or desires, can exist independently of being perceived by others, separating them from purely imaginary things. Quote 176. For this reason, we cannot, I think, possibly accept the view that the distinction between the real and the imaginary is identical with the distinction between what is dependent on the mind in the sense of being or existing only when it is an object of consciousness, and what is not so dependent. Moore argues that the difference between real and imaginary things cannot simply be reduced to whether something exists only when perceived by the mind. Some things dependent on the mind, like sense data, are still considered real, while other things dependent on the mind, like imaginary characters, are not. Quote 177. Even within the class of things entirely dependent on the mind, we find the distinction between the real and the imaginary still persisting. Moore observes that even among things that depend entirely on the mind, we can still distinguish between what is real and what is imaginary. For instance, sense data that we perceive are real, while imagined objects remain imaginary, despite both being dependent on the mind for their existence. Quote 178. It is true, as a matter of fact, that a thing which is real is always connected with something or other with which it would not have been connected if it had not been real. It always has some effect or cause or accompaniment which it would not have had if it had been imaginary. Moore highlights a characteristic of real things. They have connections, causes, or effects that imaginary things do not. This connection with other real phenomena helps us identify what is real and distinguish it from what is merely imagined. Quote 179. We are asked to admit, to say that a thing is real is to say that it has some connection or other, which it would not have had if it had not been real. And this is what turns out to be nonsense. Moore critiques the idea that the definition of reality can be reduced to having connections with other real things. He demonstrates that this approach leads to a circular and ultimately meaningless definition, as it relies on the concept of real to define itself. Quote 180. Mr. Bradley holds that one of the properties which he expresses by the word real is a property which has degrees. He constantly talks of one thing being more real or less real than another. Moore introduces Bradley's view that reality is not an absolute concept, but something that can exist in degrees. According to Bradley, some things are more real than others, which challenges the traditional binary understanding of reality versus non-reality. Quote 181. It is possible that when we say, as we should in ordinary life, that an elephant is real and a griffin is not, the property which we really have before our minds, and are ascribing to the elephant and denying to the griffin, is the highest possible degree of Mr. Bradley's first kind of reality. Moore suggests that when we call something real in everyday life, we may be unknowingly ascribing to it the highest degree of reality, as Bradley suggests. This idea implies that the distinction between real and imaginary things could be about varying degrees of reality rather than a simple binary division. Quote 182. When we imagine anything, it very often happens that we have before our minds what is sometimes called an image. Moore introduces the concept of mental imagery, explaining that when we imagine something, we often hold a mental image in our minds. This image is a kind of sense datum, akin to a faint version of what we might physically see, like a mental picture of a griffin when imagining such a creature. Quote 183. Many philosophers have, I think, supposed that these images which we have before our minds, when we imagine things, are what we imagine, that indeed imagination simply consists in having images before our minds. Moore points out that philosophers such as Berkeley and Hume often equated imagining with having mental images. In their view, the act of imagining was identical to the mental picture or image we form when we think of something, implying no separation between the imagined object and its mental representation. Quote 184. What I am imagining now is a griffin. If therefore what I am imagining is the image which I have before my mind, it follows that this image is a griffin. Moore presents a problem with equating imagination solely with mental images. If the mental image of a griffin is what we imagine, then it would mean the image itself is the griffin. Since griffins are imaginary and not real, this logic appears paradoxical, suggesting a flaw in this philosophical approach. Quote 185. We should naturally say that this image which is now before my mind is merely an image of a griffin, that it is not itself a griffin, and that what is merely an image of a thing cannot be identical with the thing of which it is an image. Moore asserts that the common-sense distinction between an image and the thing it represents holds. The mental image of a griffin is not the same as a real or imaginary griffin. It is merely an image, and thus cannot be identical to the object it depicts. Quote 186. When I remember a thing, is it or is it not the case that the images which I directly perceive at the moment of memory are identical with the object of memory, with what I remember? Moore shifts focus to the issue of memory, asking whether the mental images we perceive when we remember something are the same as the object we are recalling. This question introduces a parallel problem to the one found in imagination, where the relationship between mental images and actual objects becomes complex. Quote 187. It is quite certain that you can, in a sense, remember the sense datum which you saw just now. You know that you did see it, and can make propositions about it, as, for instance, what sort of a shape it had, and you can do this whether you are now directly perceiving any image of it or not. Moore emphasizes that we can recall sense data, such as shapes or colors we have previously perceived, even without having a mental image of them in front of us at the moment of recollection. This demonstrates that memory involves more than just perceiving images. It also involves propositional knowledge about past perceptions. Quote 188. We admit that what Mr. Smith is really remembering is part at least of what he actually saw this afternoon. When we say that Mr. Smith is remembering the color in the picture, we admit that we are asserting a relation between Mr. Smith and something which he saw this afternoon. Moore explains that memory involves recalling something from the past, such as a color seen in a picture. In this case, memory is not just a mental image, but a relation between the person remembering and the object that was originally perceived, establishing that memory connects us to past experiences beyond mere images. Quote 189. When I see this paper I am reading from, there is reason to suppose that the sense data which I directly perceive, the black marks on a whitish ground, are not identical with any part of the paper itself. Moore concludes by introducing the idea that the sense data we perceive, like the black marks on a page, are not the same as the physical objects they represent. This insight challenges the notion that perception directly connects us to objects, raising questions about the relationship between sense data and the external world. Quote 190. It is obvious, I think, that if when a man remembers a thing, his memory of it consists merely in directly perceiving something else, some image which resembles the thing he is said to remember, but is not even partially identical with it, then, in a sense, he is not conscious at all of the thing remembered when he remembers it. Moore suggests that if memory only involves perceiving an image that resembles the object of memory, but is not the object itself, then the person is not truly conscious of the thing they are remembering. The act of memory would be detached from the original object and involve only a perception of something similar. Quote 191. But the second theory is quite different. It asserts that what I remember, even what I really remember, is not identical with my memory image. Moore introduces a second theory of memory, which claims that the object of memory is distinct from the memory image. This theory suggests that even though the image may resemble the object, the person does not directly perceive the original object when remembering it. Quote 192. No other relation between me and the original sense datum is involved. I need not be in any other sense conscious of the original sense datum when I remember it. In this second theory, Moore argues that memory does not require direct consciousness of the original object, or sense datum. The relationship between the person and the object of memory is mediated solely through the resemblance between the memory image and the original sense datum. Quote 193. It is extraordinarily difficult to discover by introspection that conscious processes or mental acts ever consist in anything else at all except the direct perception of sense data. Moore highlights the difficulty of identifying through introspection whether consciousness involves anything beyond the direct perception of sense data. This raises doubts about whether mental acts like memory involve more than just direct interactions with images or impressions. Quote 194. It can be absolutely proved that we are conscious, in some sense or other, of things which are not sense data, and that we can be conscious of sense data without directly perceiving them. Moore asserts that it is possible to prove that we can be conscious of things other than sense data, and that we can be aware of sense data without directly perceiving them. This challenges the idea that consciousness is limited to direct perception of sense data. Quote 195. Obviously, you cannot know this without, in some sense, being conscious of the original sense datum itself. Moore explains that in order to know that a memory image differs from the original sense datum, a person must have some form of consciousness of the original object. This form of consciousness does not involve direct perception, yet it still allows a comparison between the image and the original sense datum. Quote 196. This obscure sort of consciousness is what I said, that even those who admit its existence seem unable to give a clear account of. Moore acknowledges that this form of consciousness, which involves being aware of something without directly perceiving it, is difficult to explain. Philosophers who admit to this type of awareness struggle to provide a clear definition of how it operates. Quote 197. The fact that we do know that memory images are often not identical with any past sense datum proves that we can remember past sense data, in this other sense, that the obscure kind of consciousness I have spoken of does sometimes actually occur. Moore concludes that since we can differentiate memory images from the original objects of memory, there must be an additional form of consciousness that allows us to recall past sense data. This obscure type of consciousness plays a critical role in memory, even if it is difficult to define clearly. Quote 198. The question which I promised to begin with now is the question what truth is, or what is the difference between true beliefs and false ones. Moore introduces the central topic of the chapter, the nature of truth and how it differentiates true beliefs from false ones. He acknowledges the complexity of this issue, emphasizing that it is challenging to think or speak clearly about truth. Quote 199. You might think that we could not choose better instances in which to investigate the essence of a false belief than such common instances as the following. I often believe such things as that my scissors are lying on the table, when, in fact, they are not. Moore suggests that everyday false beliefs, such as mistakenly thinking your scissors are on the table, provide useful examples for understanding the essence of falsehood. These beliefs are straightforward and easily relatable, offering clarity in exploring the nature of false beliefs. Quote 200. The whole essence of the mistake would lie simply in this, that whereas, on the one hand, he would be believing that we are hearing the noise of a brass band, the fact is, on the other hand, that we are not hearing it. Moore explains that the essence of a false belief in this case lies in the contradiction between what is believed and what is actually true. The belief that someone hears a brass band is false because it contradicts the fact that no such sound is being heard. Quote 201. To say that a belief is true is to say always that the fact to which it refers is or has being, while to say of a belief that it is false is to say always that the fact to which it refers is not or has no being. Moore offers a general definition of truth and falsehood, explaining that a true belief corresponds to a fact that exists, while a false belief refers to a fact that does not exist. This correspondence between belief and reality is the foundation of truth and falsehood. Quote 202. The belief is the belief that lions exist, and the fact to which the belief refers is the fact that lions exist. Moore highlights the relationship between belief and fact, showing that a belief is tied to a specific fact. If someone believes that lions exist, this belief is true only if the fact that lions exist also holds in reality, demonstrating the direct connection between belief and the facts it refers to. Quote 203. It is, therefore, I think true that the fact to which a belief refers is always the fact which has the very same name which we have to use in naming the belief. Moore points out that the fact to which a belief refers shares the same name as the belief itself. This observation underscores the close relationship between a belief and the corresponding fact, suggesting that the language we use for both is often identical. Quote 204. It must be the case, therefore, that there is always some other relation between a true belief and the fact to which it refers, some other relation which is expressed by this identity of name. Moore argues that the mere identity of names between a belief and a fact is not enough to define the relationship between them. There must be some deeper connection that explains how a belief refers to a fact, beyond the shared language used to describe both. Quote 205. The answer as to the analysis of beliefs is this. It says that, in the case of every belief without exception, whether it be true or whether it be false, we can always distinguish two constituents, namely, the act of belief, on the one hand, and the object of belief, or what is believed, on the other. Moore introduces a two-part analysis of beliefs, distinguishing between the act of believing and the object of belief. This distinction is key to understanding how beliefs function, regardless of whether they are true or false, as it separates the mental act from the content of the belief. Quote 206. It adopts the supposition that in the case of every belief, true or false, there is a proposition, which is what is believed, and which certainly is. Moore introduces the idea that all beliefs, whether true or false, are based on propositions. These propositions are the objects of belief and exist independently of whether the belief is true or false. This concept forms the foundation of a theory that links truth to propositions. Quote 207. The difference between a true and a false belief consists simply in this, that where the belief is true, the proposition, which is believed, besides the fact that it is or has being, also has another simple, unanalyzable property, which may be called truth. Moore suggests that the distinction between true and false beliefs lies in the property of truth. A true belief is a belief in a proposition that possesses this additional property of truth, while a false belief lacks this property, even though the proposition itself exists. Quote 208. We should thus have to say that the real existence of lions, the fact to which the belief that lions exist refers, consists simply in the possession by the proposition that lions exist of one simple property. Moore explains that the existence of a fact, such as the existence of lions, is tied to the proposition having the property of truth. The belief that lions exist refers to this proposition, and when the belief is true, the proposition itself holds the property of truth. Quote 209. But the second objection is an objection not only to this theory, but to the whole analysis of beliefs on which it rests. It is an objection to the supposition that there are such things as propositions at all, and that belief consists merely in an attitude of mind towards these supposed entities. Moore raises a fundamental objection to the entire theory, questioning the very existence of propositions. He suggests that beliefs might not be simply a relation between a person and a proposition, challenging the validity of the theory that separates beliefs and propositions. Quote 210. It seems rather as if the thing he was believing, the object of his belief, were just the fact which certainly is not, because his belief is false. Moore argues that in the case of a false belief, it feels as though the object of belief is the non-existent fact. This creates a problem because, if the fact does not exist, it becomes difficult to explain how a person can hold a belief about something that has no being. Quote 211. We certainly can conceive this hypothesis. We know what it would be like if we were actually hearing the noise. And in this mere supposing, in merely conceiving an hypothesis without at all believing in it, as in the present case, exactly the same difficulty arises as in the case of false belief. Moore discusses how conceiving of hypothetical situations presents a similar problem to that of false beliefs. In both cases, we deal with objects or facts that do not exist, yet we can still imagine or believe them, leading to philosophical difficulties. Quote 2-12. All that our theory compels us to say is that one part of this expression, namely the words, the proposition that 2 + 2 = 4, though it seems to be the name of something, is not really a name for anything at all. Moore explains that in his theory, the words the proposition that 2 + 2 = 4 do not actually refer to a separate entity. While the expression might seem to name something, it does not correspond to a real object, suggesting that propositions may not exist as independent entities. Quote 213. But if we thus admit that we don't know precisely what the analysis of a belief is, does it follow that we must also admit that we don't know what truth is, and what is the difference between truth and falsehood? Moore questions whether our inability to fully analyze belief implies that we cannot understand truth. He suggests that even though belief is difficult to define, we can still have a clear understanding of the essential nature of truth and the difference between truth and falsehood. Quote 214. A difficulty seemed to be felt, because I implied that we might and did commonly believe things, even when we were not quite certain or sure about them. Moore explains that belief can exist even in the absence of certainty. People often believe things without being absolutely sure, which distinguishes belief from knowledge. He uses everyday examples to show that belief is a common state of mind where we accept something as likely, even if we are not fully confident in its truth. Quote 215. We constantly have cases where a man quite definitely says, "I do believe a thing, but I am not quite sure of it." And we all of us, I think, understand quite well the distinction between the two states of mind referred to, the one called merely believing and the other called being sure. Moore highlights the distinction between believing something and being sure of it. He notes that people frequently express beliefs without certainty, illustrating that belief exists on a spectrum where one can believe something while also recognizing the possibility of being mistaken. Quote 216. Just as we often believe when we are not quite sure, so we often imagine when we neither believe in this sense nor are quite sure. Moore introduces the concept that imagination is separate from belief. People can imagine possibilities without believing in them, and they may also believe things without being sure. This demonstrates that imagination, belief, and certainty are distinct mental states. Quote 217. The best I can find are as follows. Take again the case where my friend believes that I am still in London, and doesn't believe that I have gone away for my holidays. So far as I can see, he might quite well be imagining both alternatives equally vividly, in spite of the fact that he believes the one and disbelieves the other. Moore challenges the idea that belief is solely based on the vividness of imagination. He suggests that someone can believe one thing while imagining an alternative more vividly. This implies that belief and imagination are not directly linked to how vividly a person can picture a scenario. Quote 218. It may be said that when we desire a thing very strongly, we can hardly help having some degree of belief that it will happen, and that therefore in this case it isn't true to say that we absolutely don't believe that it will happen. Moore acknowledges the common idea that desire might influence belief. When we strongly wish for something, it is often difficult to avoid believing it might happen, even if only to a small extent. However, he argues that belief and desire do not always correlate in a direct manner. Quote 219. But the words being sure or being certain are sometimes used as equivalent to knowing. And here, it seems to me, we have not only a difference of degree, but also of kind. Moore clarifies that being sure can refer to two different mental states. In one sense, it can indicate a high degree of belief, but in another, it can refer to knowledge, which is qualitatively different from belief. In knowledge, there is no room for doubt, while belief, no matter how certain, always allows for the possibility of being wrong. Quote 220. What property is there, then, which this belief, if true, really does share with other true beliefs? Well, it seems to me we can see quite plainly that this belief, if true, has to the fact that I have gone away a certain relation, which that particular belief has to no other fact. Moore explores the idea that true beliefs share a particular relationship with the facts they refer to. A true belief, such as the belief that someone has gone away, corresponds to the actual fact, and this correspondence is what distinguishes it from a false belief. Quote 221. When the belief is true, it certainly does correspond to a fact, and when it corresponds to a fact, it certainly is true. Moore explains that the concepts of truth and correspondence are equivalent. A belief is true if it corresponds to a fact, and a belief corresponds to a fact if it is true. This definition of truth emphasizes the relationship between belief and reality, where truth depends on alignment with an actual fact. Quote 222. It is this relation itself, and not any words by which we may try to name it or to point it out, that is essential to the definition of truth and falsehood. Moore asserts that the key to understanding truth and falsehood lies in the relationship between belief and fact, not in the specific words used to describe that relationship. The term correspondence is merely a convenient label for this relation. which is more important than the word itself. Quote 223. I propose to call it the relation of correspondence. Only, in giving it this name, it must be remembered that I mean by correspondence merely this particular relation which does hold between this particular belief, if true, and the fact that I have gone away. Moore clarifies that when he uses the term correspondence, he refers specifically to the relationship between a belief and the fact that makes it true. In this case, the belief that he has gone away corresponds to the fact that he has indeed gone away, illustrating how truth depends on the connection between belief and fact. Quote 224. All that I claim then so far is that very often, when we say that a belief is true, a necessary and sufficient condition for its being so is simply this, that it should correspond to a fact. Moore emphasizes that for a belief to be true, it must correspond to a fact. This correspondence is both necessary and sufficient to establish the truth of a belief, meaning that truth hinges on this relationship between belief and reality. Quote 225. One such obvious fact is that my friend's belief that I have gone away for the holidays certainly will be true in one common sense of the word, if and only if I actually have gone away. Moore provides a straightforward example of how truth works in practice. If his friend believes that he has gone away for the holidays, this belief will be true if and only if he has, in fact, gone away. The truth of the belief depends entirely on the correspondence with the actual event. Quote 226. The first theory I wish to mention is a theory, or perhaps rather a whole set of different theories, which are advocated by some philosophers who call themselves pragmatists. Moore introduces the pragmatist theory of truth, which differs from his own correspondence theory. Pragmatists often claim that a belief is true if it works or leads to satisfactory results, a view that Moore critiques for potentially disconnecting truth from factual correspondence. Quote 227. It implies that my friend's belief that I had gone away for my holidays might be true in every sense of the word, even if I had not gone away. That it would be thus true, provided only it led up to certain kinds of satisfactory results. Moore criticizes the pragmatist approach, which suggests that a belief could be considered true even if it doesn't correspond to reality, as long as it leads to useful or satisfactory outcomes. He argues that this perspective conflicts with the common understanding of truth as tied to facts. Quote 228. If all beliefs were partially false, it does, I think, follow that all are wholly false. Moore addresses Bradley's theory that all beliefs are partially true and partially false. He argues that if this were the case, then every belief would be wholly false, as the inclusion of any false element would undermine the overall truth of the belief. This challenges Bradley's view and supports the idea that some beliefs can be entirely true. Quote 229. It seems as if purely imaginary things, even though they be absolutely self-contradictory like a round square, must still have some kind of being, must still be in a sense, simply because we can think and talk about them. Moore addresses the paradox of imaginary concepts like a round square. Even though such concepts are logically impossible, we can still think and talk about them, which suggests that they must possess some form of being or existence, even if only in thought. Quote 230. Taken by themselves, they are not a name for anything at all, although the whole expression, "he believes that I am not in London," is a name for something. Moore points out that individual phrases or words may seem to refer to something, but they often do not represent anything real. However, when these phrases are part of a larger expression, such as a belief, the entire statement can refer to a real fact or event. Quote 231. I am going to say, then, in spite of the contradiction which such language seems to imply, that certain things which we can think of and talk about really have no being, in any sense at all. Moore reiterates that, even though language may suggest otherwise, some things we can conceive of or discuss truly do not exist in any way. This includes imaginary or logically impossible entities, reinforcing the idea that not all conceivable things have being. Quote 232. I propose to confine the name being to this property, and I think you can all see what the property in question is. Moore defines being as the property that something must have in order to exist in the universe. This property distinguishes things that are real from those that are purely imaginary or non-existent, clarifying his use of the term throughout his discussion. Quote 233. So far as I can see, when we say of one thing that it is a fact, and of another that it has being or is a constituent of the universe, the property which we mean to assert of the two things is exactly the same in both cases. Moore suggests that the concepts of being and fact are essentially the same. When we say something is a fact, we are attributing to it the same property we assign when we say it has being or is part of the universe. This aligns the two terms in a meaningful way. Quote 234. I started on them with two different objects. The first was this. We found that Mr. Bradley asserted most emphatically that time is not real, while on the other hand, he seemed to assert, equally emphatically, that time does exist, and indubitably is. Moore introduces the conflicting views of Mr. Bradley regarding time. Bradley asserts that time is not real, while simultaneously claiming that time exists. This apparent contradiction is central to Moore's exploration of the concepts of reality and existence, as he aims to determine whether Bradley is using different meanings for these terms. Quote 235. We must, therefore, I think, admit that we can, in a sense, think of things which absolutely have no being. Moore concludes that, although we can conceive of and talk about things that do not exist, they ultimately have no being. This distinction is important in separating things that exist only in thought from those that have actual existence in the world. Quote 236. Another way of pointing out what this property is, which I mean by being, and a way which does, I think, serve to make it clearer in some respects, is to say that to have being is equivalent to belonging to the universe. Moore explains being as equivalent to belonging to the universe. This suggests that anything with being is a constituent of the universe, and to say something has no being is to say it does not belong to the universe at all. Quote 237. In short, we mustn't suppose that there is such a thing as a chimera, merely because we can do something which we call thinking of it and making propositions about it. Moore warns against assuming that something like a chimera exists just because we can think about it. The ability to think or make statements about a thing does not imply that it has actual being or existence. Quote 238. It is important to notice that facts are neither more nor less than what are often called truths. Moore highlights that the terms facts and truths are essentially interchangeable. A fact can be referred to as a truth and vice versa, showing that these concepts share the same fundamental nature when describing reality. Quote 239. I used to hold very strongly, what many other people are also inclined to hold, that the words being and existence do stand for two entirely different properties. Moore reflects on his earlier belief that being and existence referred to different properties. However, he now questions this distinction, suggesting that being and existence may actually refer to the same concept, though applied differently to various types of things. Quote 240. I have said that some people are inclined to make a distinction between being and existence of the following kind. They hold that there are in the universe enormous numbers of things, which undoubtedly have being, and which yet do not exist. Moore introduces the distinction that some philosophers make between being and existence. According to this view, certain things undeniably are in some sense, meaning they have being, but they do not exist in the conventional sense, drawing a line between these two concepts. Quote 241. The first was the class of things which I proposed last time to call facts or truths, and I am very anxious to make it quite clear exactly what sort of things I do mean by facts or truths. Moore clarifies his use of the terms facts and truths, emphasizing the need to precisely define these terms. He points out that these concepts are often ambiguous, but for his purposes, they refer to specific kinds of things that hold a certain status within the universe. Quote 242. It is quite often used simply and solely as a name for the class of things I mean, but it is also quite often used both in a wider and in a narrower sense. Moore acknowledges that the word fact is used in multiple ways. Sometimes it refers exactly to what he means by facts, but it is also used in broader or narrower contexts, contributing to confusion over its precise meaning. Quote 243. A truth, therefore, cannot be identified with a true act of belief. Moore differentiates between a truth and an act of belief. A truth exists independently of whether someone believes it or not. This distinction is essential in understanding that truth is not simply a product of individual beliefs, but something that corresponds to reality. Quote 244. As I explained, I don't now believe that there are such things as propositions at all. I don't believe that beliefs can be analyzed, in this way, into the act of belief on the one hand, and the proposition which is believed on the other hand. Moore expresses skepticism about the existence of propositions. He no longer believes that beliefs can be divided into an act of belief and a corresponding proposition, challenging a traditional philosophical view that separates belief from the content it refers to. Quote 245. By a truth, therefore, I mean something which is neither a true act of belief nor a true proposition. Moore defines truth as something distinct from both an act of belief and a proposition. This redefinition sets truth apart as a separate entity, something that exists independently of belief and propositions, underscoring its objective nature. Quote 246. There are ever so many truths and facts which nobody has ever known. Ever so many truths that nobody has discovered yet. Moore highlights the idea that many truths and facts exist, even if no one has yet discovered them. This statement reinforces the concept that truth is independent of human knowledge or discovery, existing regardless of whether anyone is aware of it. Quote 247. Truths, therefore, are one of the two classes of things, with regard to which it may, I think, be plausibly urged that they are, but don't exist. Moore identifies truths as one of two categories of things that are, in a certain sense, but do not exist in the way we typically understand existence. This reinforces the earlier distinction between being and existence, placing truths in the category of things that have being without conventional existence. Quote 248. The fact that A is a member of that group is not a relation, it is a fact or a truth, and is a good instance of the sort of thing I mean by a fact or a truth. Moore clarifies that being a member of a group, such as A being part of a set, is not a relation, but a fact. He uses this as an example to distinguish between facts and relations, emphasizing that facts refer to truths about objects, while relations describe connections between objects. Quote 249. What I want to maintain, and what is, I think, as clear as anything can be, is that A really has to that group precisely and identically the same relation as that which B has to it. Moore asserts that both A and B have the same relationship to the group they belong to. He points out that while the facts about A and B being members of the group are different, the relation they have to the group is identical. Quote 250. We must therefore distinguish strictly between relations on the one hand and truths or facts on the other. Moore emphasizes the need to clearly differentiate between relations and facts. Relations describe how objects connect with one another, while facts are truths that describe the status or properties of objects. Quote 251. A has the property of being a member of the group A and B also has precisely the same identical property. Moore explains that both A and B share the property of being members of the group A and B. This property is the same for both, distinguishing it from individual facts about A or B being in the group. Quote 252. The relation is a constituent of the property, but is not identical with it, and the property again is a constituent of the truth or fact, but is not identical with it. Moore elaborates on the distinction between relations, properties, and facts. He explains that relations form part of properties, and properties in turn are part of facts. However, none of these are identical with each other, showing how each plays a distinct role in describing objects and their connections. Quote 253. The property called being a member of the group A and B is a property which does belong both to A and to B, but which certainly does not belong to this third patch C. Moore contrasts the shared property of A and B with a third object, C, which does not share this property. This highlights how properties can be common to certain objects, but not extend to others, reinforcing the specific nature of properties. Quote 254. We must therefore distinguish the relation which A and B both have to A and B from the property of having this relation to A and B, which belongs to them both. Moore again stresses the distinction between the relation that connects A and B to their group and the property of having this relation. This separation of concepts helps avoid confusion between the object's connections and their shared attributes. Quote 255. We can't deny that a whitish yellow, however much more yellow than white it may be, yet if it is white at all in any degree is, in a sense, white. Moore discusses the difficulty in defining the property of whiteness. He points out that even objects that are mostly yellow but contain a hint of white can still be called white in some sense, demonstrating how properties can exist in varying degrees. Quote 256. I have tried to show that there certainly are in the universe two different kinds of universals, or general ideas, namely 1. Relations, and 2. Properties, which consist in the having of a relation to something or other. Moore begins by clarifying that the universe contains two distinct types of universals, relations and properties. Relations connect objects, while properties refer to the possession of specific qualities, especially in relation to other things. This division sets up his further exploration of a potential third category of universals. Quote 257. Beside these two kinds, there probably also are in the universe universals of a third, quite different kind. Moore introduces the possibility of a third category of universals, which are distinct from both relations and properties. He believes these universals are important, but often overlooked in philosophical discussions, despite their presence in everyday thought and speech. Quote 258. Every patch of yellowish white does, I think, undoubtedly resemble every patch of pure white more closely, in one respect, than any patch of pure yellow ever resembles any patch of pure white. Moore uses this example to illustrate the varying degrees of resemblance between different colors. He emphasizes that yellowish-white patches share a closer resemblance to pure white than pure yellow does, particularly in terms of color, suggesting that resemblance is an important property. Quote 259. The resemblance, in respect of color, between a pure white patch and a yellowish-white patch is always greater than that between a pure white patch and a pure yellow patch. Moore continues to explore the idea of resemblance in color, stating that yellowish-white patches more closely resemble pure white patches than pure yellow ones do. This concept of resemblance in a specific respect, here, color, becomes central to identifying common properties. Quote 260. Each of them really does have the property of either possessing the required degree of resemblance in respect of color to all the pure white patches, or being a pure white patch. Moore points out a disjunctive property that applies to all white patches. Either the patch closely resembles pure white in color, or it is a pure white patch itself. This disjunctive property distinguishes white patches from anything else in the universe, demonstrating a universal characteristic of white objects. Quote 261. But most people would, I think, be inclined to say that this disjunctive property can't be the only one, besides membership of the group, which belongs to all the group of white patches and to nothing else. Moore acknowledges that many people might believe that the disjunctive property he describes is not the only property shared by all white patches. This leaves room for the possibility of other, non-disjunctive properties that could explain the commonality among white patches. Quote 162. We certainly should naturally say of all of them, except the pure white ones, that there was some white in all of them. Moore explains that it is natural to claim that even non-pure white patches contain some amount of white. This notion suggests that the presence of white, in varying degrees, is a property shared by all patches that are at least partially white, reinforcing the idea of a common quality among white objects. Quote 263. It may be held that, in spite of their difference in size and shape, and in spite of the fact that they are in two different places, the two patches themselves are not different, but one and the same. Moore considers a view that challenges the idea that two different patches of white, despite their differences in size, shape, and location, could be understood as being identical. While this view is paradoxical, it suggests that a single universal, such as pure white, could exist in multiple places simultaneously. Quote 264. It seems to be held, first, that in so calling it, you again imply that it is the work of the mind, and this should perhaps be put down as a second separate reason why people have supposed that all universals are the work of the mind. Moore discusses a common misconception that universals are merely the product of mental processes, created by the mind through abstraction. He notes that this belief arises from confusing the act of thinking with the existence of the things being thought about, leading some philosophers to incorrectly assume that universals depend on the mind for their existence. Quote 265. The process of abstraction is a process by which we become aware of universals. It is our awareness of them which is a product of the process, not the universals themselves. Moore clarifies that abstraction is not the process by which universals are created, but rather the means by which we become conscious of them. Universals exist independently of our awareness of them, and the mental act of abstraction merely brings them to our attention. Quote 266. But many philosophers seem to suppose that when you call a thing an abstraction, you imply two things about it. It seems to be held, first, that in so calling it, you again imply that it is the work of the mind. Moore reiterates that calling something an abstraction often leads to the mistaken belief that it is a mental creation. This misunderstanding results from conflating the abstract nature of universals with the mental process of conceptualizing them. Quote 267. I have distinguished three different kinds of constituents of the universe, namely, 1. Particulars, 2. Truths or facts, and 3. Universals. Moore categorizes the components of the universe into three distinct types: particulars, which are specific, individual entities, truths or facts, which describe reality, and universals, which represent general properties or relations. This classification helps clarify the different ways in which things exist or are understood within the universe. Quote 268. It is certainly more natural to say of a particular thing that it exists than to say this of the truth that twice 2 are 4, or of the number 2 itself, though the usage is certainly not fixed. Moore notes that it is more intuitive to speak of particular objects as existing than to use the term exist for abstract truths or numbers. This reflects common language patterns, even though abstract entities like numbers or facts also are, in some sense, contributing to the philosophical discussion of being versus existence. Quote 269. The property of being, which certainly does belong to truths and universals as well as to particulars, is ever so much more important than any which distinguishes them from one another. Moore emphasizes that the most significant property shared by particulars, truths, and universals is their being. This quality, which applies to all three, is more crucial than any differences that separate them, highlighting the foundational importance of existence or being across various types of entities. Quote 270. The fundamental question for philosophy is to discover whether certain things do or do not belong to the universe in this sense. Moore asserts that one of the most important tasks of philosophy is determining whether things truly belong to the universe, that is, whether they have being. This distinction between what exists and what does not is central to philosophical inquiry, shaping our understanding of reality. Quote 271. Universals are not in any way to be classed with griffins and chimeras. That, on the contrary, there is the most fundamental difference in the universe between the two. Moore draws a critical distinction between universals and purely fictional entities like griffins and chimeras. While universals, such as properties and relations, are real components of the universe, fictional entities do not belong to reality. This difference is far more important than distinctions within real entities, such as between particulars and universals. Some Main Problems of Philosophy by G.E. Moore ultimately reinforces the value of common sense and a realistic understanding of the external world. Moore presents a defense of the belief that we have direct knowledge of external objects, arguing against skepticism and idealism. He delves into the intricacies of perception, asserting that while our sense data might vary, it remains possible to have genuine knowledge of the world. Throughout the lectures, Moore maintains that rigorous analysis can reconcile philosophical complexity with our intuitive beliefs about reality, making a compelling case for the reliability of ordinary experiences as the basis for understanding.
Curious to dive into the mind of G.E. Moore? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of some main problems of philosophy in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.